Yitzhak Rabin, in my view, is the leader in Israel that completely understood the problem between the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict is a polarity to be managed. He didn't use the term. The reason why I say that he's totally understood it, he is the one leader in Israel that made concessions big time. And the consequence of that was people who wanted to solve the problem assassinated him.
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. My name is Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father-son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Last week, we talked about the topic of low performance. It was in high demand. A lot of people had been commenting on YouTube, on social media as well, asking for us to talk about that. And so we did. And naturally, as part of that, a large component of helping us to create a roadmap for high performance for our teams was talking about feedback. How do we both give and receive feedback in a healthy manner? And on that note, we did receive some feedback, some good feedback actually, on and perhaps a correction. Should we address that correction?
A guy by the name of Bob Moran, he sent me a message, and the feedback is that I like this episode, really very good. But just a small correction, Idris, he said, when you referred to Shell getting rid of the CEP, which you call
current
estimated potential assessment, stop doing it because the Shell had stopped using the assessment on HAIR, that means helicopter analysis, imagination, and reality. Since they stopped doing it, they've stopped then doing potential assessment. Actually, no, he said. Shell have not stopped doing that. They have replaced HAIR with CAR, which is capacity, achievement, motivation, and relationship, CAR. But they still do potential assessment. So thank you, Bob, for highlighting that. It was a small correction I'd like to make here.
Yeah. So in short, the correction was that what you said in the last episode was that Shell has completely done away with
potential assessment.
Yes, correct, with a potential assessment. Yeah. But the correction is that they have not stopped with it, but in fact they have replaced it with another form of it. Yeah. Potentially less contentious model of doing potential assessment. While we're on that, I thought also, in terms of feedback, Abel Chia, who is our associate vicar at HTBB, he particularly enjoyed last week's episode. And I think as we were talking about feedback, he then had some thoughts then about conflict resolution, because sometimes if we are unable to handle or give or receive feedback well, then sometimes those feedback conversations can potentially become negative, can potentially give room to resentment. So I thought as a good follow-up, it might be good for us to talk about what healthy conflict resolution looks like. Sometimes we can often have this idea that conflict is a bad thing, and I know I've been guilty of it myself. I think being guilty for trying to avoid conflict for as much as possible. But, I really like what Jordan Peterson said. He once said somewhere that conflict delayed is conflict multiplied. Mm-hmm. There's real value, actually, in being able to have difficult conversations, but to do that with the right tools and the right guardrails. One example is my wife and I, Andrea, we have, for a long time, we had worked together. And in our previous job, where we were both leading a team together, what I found particularly useful is that because we already had an existing framework for managing conflict at home, that meant that when it came to work-related matters, we would not shy away from dealing with conflicts head-on and resolving them quickly. And, it's quite interesting because if you compare that with, let's say, another kind of work partnership where perhaps you don't have that additional layer of relationship, then generally speaking, in the time it takes for a conventional partnership to have one conflict, Andrea and I would have been able to have 20 conflicts brought up and also managed. And the quicker you're able to get those things out of the way, the quicker you're able to then continue and to focus on achieving your true north. But the key is, how do we then do it in a healthy in a healthy and in a structured manner as well.
Yeah.
Maybe, Dad, could you give some examples or give some
Yeah.
color to what healthy conflict resolution has looked like for you in your career?
Let's put it this way, Leon. I stand from a position of thinking of someone who is in the conflict, trying to find a way to reach out to that other person who is also in the conflict to try and find some resolution. So that's one way to look at it. The other one to look at it is someone who is independent, being tasked with the job of bringing 2 or 3 aggrieved parties in a conflict to come together to find a conflict resolution. So whichever person you are involved in, so what I'm going to talk about might be helpful to each of those persons. There are always 2 steps to conflict resolution. One is very simple, the planning and preparation stage, very important. You made reference to conflict delayed is conflict amplified. And that's most of the time, I would say 90% of the reasons why conflicts are delayed is because they've not spent time to prepare for the conflict resolution. You do not jump into trying to resolve a conflict just like that unless you have prepared a strategy or a plan to deal with it. So that's step 1, to prepare. So I would say to fail to prepare a conflict resolution is definitely going to lead to a failure in the conflict resolution. That's when to preparation is important. And the second thing is once you've prepared it, then you go and execute the plan. Let me say, in phase 1 and phase 2 of the conflict resolution, there are 3 key principles. And these are the 3 key principles that guide everything that we're going to talk about. You referred to healthy conflict. The first step element, the principle is this: to bring down the tension so that people are no longer shouting and screaming at one another so that they become rational. So in planning for it, you have to think very hard, how are you going to bring down the tension between the aggrieved parties so that they become rational in thinking it through? So that's step number 1. The second one, this is very important, Leon. And I would say this, I dare say today, what I'm going to say here is going to reach out to people in a manner that's called the aha moment. Why I would say it's aha is this: I believe there are 2 sets of conflicts in this world, not 3, only 2. The first type of conflict comes from a problem that needs to be resolved, that people have a disagreement about a solution to that problem, but there is a perfect answer to it. For example, if your car breaks down, there are 3 people that argue there's a different way how to fix the problem with that car. But if you bring it to a mechanic, an expert, he will know exactly what the problem is. So it's a problem to be solved, but not listening to the 3 guys having an opinion on the roadside, figuring out how to do it. You bring an expert to go and do this. A medical doctor, if you have fractured metatarsal, 3 or 4 people in the room will give their own feedback and views, and they have a quarrel about what to do with the fractured metatarsal. But it is a problem to be solved. But you bring it to a specialist in that area, an orthopedic, they will know exactly what to do with it. So these are what I call problem to be solved. This is the first type of conflict. The second one is the aha moment. That means conflict that come from polarities to be managed. These are not problems to be solved. And when I say polarities to be managed, you will never find a problem that solve, a solution that solve the problem permanently. For example, the polarities to be managed is, you think about it in this way, Leon, the North Pole and the South Pole. You cannot remove the North Pole. You cannot remove the South Pole either, and that's why we call it polarities. And if you remove one, the world will go out of orbit. So it will always be there. And these kinds of conflicts that come from polarities to be managed, they stem from a few areas. One is deep-rooted religious convictions and deep-rooted beliefs that you have on certain things. Those are very deep-rooted. There could be assumptions, they're really deep-rooted. The other one, polarities come from lifelong habits. They're not religious, no convictions, but if someone is always just on time for events, as opposed to someone that wants to be 1 hour ahead of time. You will always find those two
This
people.
one, I think you're speaking from personal experience here.
Yeah, my wife and I have this kind of polarities. And so you will never find a solution to this. It will always be there because of lifelong habits. The third area where it comes through is entrenched nationalism and tribalism. And this tribalism, I referred to it in manifested in things like Chelsea Football Club. Come what may, I will always be a die-hard fan of Chelsea Football Club. You could say tribalism can manifested in political parties. However bad Donald Trump appears today, the folks that belong to the Republican Party will vote for him or her. And so this is deep-rooted tribalism and nationalism. So when you have these kinds of things that come through it, you will never actually find real problems to solve these polarities. You will always find solutions that I call concessions, trade-offs. Never such thing as a 100% solution. So that comes to my third point, and I spend a lot of time on second point. The third point is this principle of conflict resolutions. Your solutions must be tailored to whether it is a problem to be solved or it's polarities to be managed. These are the three. And if you walk around, I call it putting the type of conflict into the wrong folder. If it is a problem to be solved, and if you think it's polarities to be managed, you're suboptimal because you don't find a solution to it that's permanent. But the other way around is worse. If it's not a problem to be solved, but it's a polarities to be managed, but if you put in the wrong folder, that you reckon this polarity must be solved in a permanent way, you live your life very miserable.
This is especially important when it comes actually to long-term relationships, whether with a spouse or with just a partner.
Absolutely.
I think that is one of the most important things.
Very important. And if you try to resolve the problem with your partner, you will have incessant quarrel and you probably lead to divorce. So you must put it in the right folder and you say, this person has a lifelong habit doing this, and I can never kick off that habit, whatever come what may, and therefore I have to learn to live with it. So when you have to learn to live with it, it simply means the give and take strategy. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's polarities to be managed. And if you're looking for permanent solution to this problem, then you're going to live miserable life. So back to my point, if you do not file it in the right folder, you'll become a very miserable, very, very miserable. So that's the three important principles how to deal with conflict resolutions. But in phase 1 and phase 2, those three principles apply.
Yeah.
In thinking about it and planning it through, and in executing it too.
Yeah.
Let me refer to the tensions as example. State principle number 1. When I was in Malaysia Airlines, there were some issues that we had with the parliamentarians. They were always having something to say quite negative about Malaysia Airlines, and they referred to it, and it's in Parliament. They asked all sorts of questions. Of course, we are not in Parliament, so we kept on giving answers that we have to the Ministry of Transport, and then they use them to provide the answers. The more answers they give, the more questions are posed to them. So I then said, why don't we resolve this conflict? And I figured out, why don't we invite the parliamentarians outside Parliament and invite them to a party, a dinner, we serve them, and then we will then address the questions. But I knew the first thing that I had to deal with is how to bring down the tensions, because they were already very unhappy and rowdy about it. So my team and I figured out, if we invite them to come, most people who have flown on Malaysia Airlines, they know how nice our cabin crew are, the men and the women. They are very hospitable. They're very, very good people. And so the hospitality there is going to reduce the tension. So we invited them. We told them we will serve them the same kind of food on the plane, and we will serve them, and with our cabin crew in the uniforms that will come. So we booked up a very nice venue, and we invited the parliamentarians. Many of them came. And as soon as they saw the cabin crew there, you could see the level of tensions coming down. I remember clearly the boisterous Bung Mokhtar. I mean, this guy was one of the biggest critic of us at that time. When he came into the room, he looked at all the cabin crew, and then he came to see me, shook my hand. Salam dulu, Dato Sri, nanti mau hantam. I mean, he already was joking about it. The fact that he could laugh about it, the tension was brought down.
Yeah.
And by the time I went out there to tell them the facts, etc., explaining to them the facts, the rationale for why we were doing it like that, there was no more hantam, simply because the tensions was brought down, and we knew exactly how we were going to bring down the facts. They were prepared to listen to the facts. And at that time, it was wonderful. And we found out every time we had problem with the parliamentarians, at that time when I was there, we organized a dinner, we brought them in there, we deal with it, and that's how we resolve the conflicts. I mean, so these are real things that you have to think about how to resolve the conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, it reminds me of a debate that I saw recently. And this was a debate between Richard Dawkins and one of his former proteges, a lady called Ayan Hirsi Ali.
Ah, I've seen that too.
Former hardcore atheist who came to faith.
Yeah.
And I thought that I've seen many debates.
She was a Muslim before as well.
Yes, she was a Muslim, and then she became a very, very strong advocate for atheism, and then now is a Christian. And I've seen many debates against Richard Dawkins, and unfortunately, in a lot of the debates, if we just talk about debate performance alone, I mean, never mind what our beliefs are,
right.
I would often say that Richard Dawkins probably comes out stronger in the debate. But what I thought was particularly interesting about this one was that maybe it helps that they already had a friendship before all of this. But I like that she did not come into the debate with an antagonistic mindset. But rather, she did that. She reduced, or she lowered the tension by helping to identify a common ground between the two of them. And so she started by saying, okay, I don't want to go into the technicalities, because he kept pushing her to say, but why do you believe in Jesus? Surely that the evidence does not match up. And she didn't entertain that side of the debate, but rather she spoke a little bit more philosophically about the value of believing in something, regardless of whether you think that my Christian faith is the correct thing to believe in. She said, you enjoy the arts, which means surely that when you enjoy a piece of art, there's a sense of hope that you get from it. So in the same way that you choose to find that kind of hope and joy in something like the arts, well, I have chosen to do that with Christianity. So she didn't try to say Christianity is correct and atheism is wrong. She found the common ground, which was just a belief or a desire for hope. And then through that, the best part of this is she said, well, and so by that token, my dear Richard, I would say that maybe you are probably a better Christian than a lot of other Christians that I know. And that immediately broke the tension because, absolutely. He was all smiles after that. And I just thought that was such a great way to approach conflict, to approach a debate.
Yeah, sure.
Like you said, it's about lowering tensions. But I think in order to do that well, I think a value that underpins all of those three steps that you mentioned earlier is the ability to listen well.
Yeah, sure.
Because if you're unable to listen well, then you will also be unable to find what are those levers that I can pull to reduce tensions. So maybe let's talk a little bit about listening.
Listening, yeah.
How do you listen well?
So as I said before, the preparation stage is one. The other one is the execution of that, when you actually are there to mediate it. So absolutely right about the Ayan method of common ground, and also listening. Those are very important. I would say with a few more that I would add. So first of all, listen well. Take down exactly where the points of contentions are, and write it down. Actually, if you write it down, after you've written down the point of contention, it will be very useful for you to go back and ask the person, this is what I wrote down from what I heard from you, and I'm going to repeat it. Do you think I got it right? Because if you get that right, that's also a starting point that the person knows you're listening. Please write it down and repeat it. and then ask for affirmation from the other aggrieved parties whether you have got it right. And this is a big signal that they know you're listening to them. That's first point. The second one is the point that you said after you listen to them, retort it, put it back. And the other one to write down the common areas. If there are 10 areas of dispute, the issues there, if you can come out and say of the 10 things that we think are on this subject that you are talking, of the 10 things, seven areas we actually commonly agree, where there's no dispute in the 7 areas, but there are only dispute that we have for 3 of the 10 things. And therefore, once you begin to put that down, suddenly you realize that you have more in common than you have disagreements about. That's also a starting point. Then, as I said, having now put that there, you can then say to them, begin by saying, I looked at our disputes. I believe that our problem is, if it is a polarity to be managed, begin by saying, I don't think it's a problem to be solved. It's a polarity to be managed, because you and I are entrenched in a position where we are never going to find a solution. If I push mine, it will mean that all of it is winner takes all. If you push yours, winner takes all. I believe that our problem here is a problem that will have to be managed through a polarity resolution. But if it's a problem to be solved, then you should say to them, actually, item number 1 where we don't agree with, it is a problem that needs to be resolved. And that's bring in the experts to solve it. If it's a legal issue, bring the best potential lawyers. If it's you and I having conflict about an acquisition of an asset, because I have a different price and you have a different price, you bring professional valuer. And if we have a dispute over who the valuer is, why don't we say this? You and I put the best valuer that I think is available. You put another independent valuer that you think is best, that from your standpoint. We both put in a third independent person that is there, and that they are the 3 valuers. And we conclude that there are 3 of them that do valuation. And if the third person comes closer to one of them, we accept it. And this is what exactly happened in the International Court of Justice. When there's dispute between countries over an island, in fact, the dispute we have between Malaysia and Singapore over the little island there, we brought it out to the International Court of Justice. When they came out independent view, we have now no choice but to accept, because we agreed the rules of the game was, we put it out there, and we cannot, that's a problem to be solved. Now, so once you have already said that to them, you say to them, it's a polarity to be managed rather than a problem to be solved, and therefore, we will make the concessions. I will begin by saying, what are the concessions I am prepared to make? So you should say, I make these concessions, and to find a middle ground, and hoping that from your side, that you will find a solution, concessions to be made, because you're never going to win all of it. I'm never going to win all of it. So you begin by making the concessions. And if you begin by making the concessions, the person will say, that's not good enough for me. Then you say, why it's not good enough? And then you said, can you find different solutions to it? I began by giving this. Can you also give a different solutions that you think best benefit from your standpoint? And when you start doing this, you can take a break at some point to think it through. And normally, at some point, the tensions will rise in the execution. Some words, and by the way, try to use neutral language. Don't use language that cause the tensions to rise. Try to look for language that's very neutral and calming people down. But obviously, as human beings, when the arguments are there, then all sorts of language will come. When you know that the feeling, the tensions, take a break. You said it's a good time for us to take a break here, to calm things down, to people are rational, to thinking it through. Then you take a break. People come and take a break and try to do that. And so many iterations of this. You don't resolve conflicts in one go. Sometimes 3 or 4 times that you have meetings or resolution discussions, maybe 4 times, 5 times, 6 times, you'll find them. And when you start doing that, you start listening to the other side, then you'll find you can find resolutions with this. And conflict resolutions exist with unions. Management in union, tremendous I've been involved with many discussions with union about them wanting to go on strike. And when you talk to them in the manner that I just described, you'll be surprised. Actually, the answers lie in something very, very benign and simple that you never ever thought about. And that's our experience I had with the unions. And many times when I think that this is what they're really interested in, when you really sit with them, actually this is what they're interested in. As far as they're concerned, this is an area that's red line for us. And they don't tell you the red line, they tell you all of these are red line. But when you sit down with them quietly, properly, when you make concessions, then they say, tell me where your red lines are. They tell you red lines, and it's okay, I can concede that. But for me, these are my red lines. But then you realize there's a lot of areas here that are no red lines. But there are perceptions between us that they're all red lines, and that therefore we never discuss them. So when you begin by saying it's polarity to be managed, then you're looking for compromises and give and take. But biggest problem I have today is that people always try to solve problems, permanent solutions, and therein lies the problem. This is the same problem we have, Leon, with what's happening in Israel and what's happening with Palestine. Because if you try to resolve the problem, you will never find a resolution to this problem. This problem is polarity to be managed. And the whole world will be on its knees to try to resolve this problem. It ain't going to be resolved.
Yeah. Henry Kissinger said that true diplomacy is the ability to restrain power, or rather is power restrained. And I think when you are able to address or identify what is the problem to be solved, what is the polarity to be managed, let's say you've identified this thing to be a polarity to be managed, you'll probably be approaching it from a more secure place. And when you are very secure about yourself, but also very secure of what it is you are ultimately trying to achieve, then I think you'll be more willing more comfortable with making certain concessions, more comfortable to restrain power where necessary in order to win the war and not be overly focused on the little battles that might come in the middle. Because like you say, sometimes there's that cliche of sometimes you need to lose the battle but win the war.
Absolutely. Yitzhak Rabin, Leon. Yitzhak Rabin, in my view, is the leader in Israel that completely understood the problem between the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict is a polarity to be managed. He didn't use the term. The reason why I say that he's totally understood it, he is the one leader in Israel that made concessions, big time. And the consequence of that was people who wanted to solve the problem assassinated him. That's why we lost a real statesman that could have really found a way how to manage the polarities between Israel as well as the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, as I said, the guy was assassinated clearly because people were looking for a way how to permanently resolve this. And we are both a Christian, Leon. In the Bible, it says, all conflicts that exist, all wars that exist today, they will find an end to except this one. This will never be ended. And it's true. And you found all sorts of wars that happen in this world today, Second World War, First World War, they all had been resolved. Even the Berlin Wall had come down. But this one, the Bible have said it will never be resolved until the end of the earth. And so in my mind, this prophecy in the Bible is solid and absolutely there. And I looked at it too and I examined the problems there. It's so multifaceted. I'm totally convinced that the world have to accept the fact that this problem cannot be resolved, but it's a polarity to be managed. You have to find a way where the Jews and the Palestinian people have to make concessions with one another, not one or the other. You can't do that. You can't drive all the Jews outside the world, outside there. You can't drive all the Palestinians out. They have to learn to live together, and there will be continuous problems between them because they are deep-rooted religious beliefs that they have, but you got to learn how to live together. And these tensions will be there. You cannot remove the tensions. They will always be there. It will take a long time for deep-rooted convictions and deep-rooted habits and things and assumptions and views that exist. But they've got to learn how to manage the polarities.
But to do that well comes at a cost. And you just gave an example
Yeah.
of sometimes that costing your own life.
Yeah.
But on a smaller scale, I think the big thing that it will cost us first and foremost is your ego.
Absolutely.
That you have to be able to drop that in order to make concessions to know what is going to be right. Again, going back to the true north.
Yeah.
What good is it for me to be right in this one argument
Yeah.
if it's only going to detract us from the true north? In order to resolve or to manage conflict, you have to be willing to pay, whether it's your ego or in an extreme case, sometimes your own life. And then we see that in the Bible.
Right.
Jesus stood for what he believed in. I had tremendous issues with this last time because I used to think, well, why couldn't he just prove that he was the Son of God? Why did he allow these people to to torture him and to kill him? Why didn't he stand up for himself?
Why is that the case? Holiness and evil, sin and righteousness, there are polarities to be managed. As long as you have righteousness there and you have sins, these are the positive and the negative. And when you have that, when people are given by God the volition to choose to sin or not to sin, immediately you will have the polarities exist. It will only be resolved if God says, I do not want sin to exist. I remove the volition for humankind to be able to make the choice to sin or not to sin. And so when he does that, then there is no more polarities. It's a problem to be solved. But God has decided in his wisdom, because he is a God of justice. If a God is a God of justice, he must give volition to choose. He gives us a choice. He doesn't force us. God is not a God that forces us to be holy and to be sinful, because he's a God of justice, and therefore he gives a volition to choose to sin or not to sin. God is also a God of love. He's a God of omniscience and omnipotence, and all the characters of God, they are manifest in many, many different things. In many sense, Leon, many of the philosophical or theological difficulties we have in framing God is because we don't understand that God is multifaceted. If you think that God is only a God of love, and if he's only a God of righteousness, there will be no sin in this world. But God is also a God of justice. He doesn't force us to love him. He doesn't force us to be righteous. And that is why we are given that polarity, righteousness and unrighteousness, or sin or evil. And all of these are polarities.
And that is the beauty of choice, isn't it? Because when we are able to believe in something that is purely on our own volition, that means that we believe with conviction. And surely it is better to believe with conviction than to be simply told you need to believe this is the truth. Let's go back to the topic. On an interpersonal relationship level, what are some helpful mindsets? We talked about, I think, understanding what is a problem to be solved and a polarity to be managed, in also helping you to manage your own expectations of the engagement or of the discussion. But Abel, whom I talked about earlier, Abel Chia is our associate vicar at HTBB. He's also my mentor in the workplace, and he posted something the other day. I'm just gonna quickly get it up because I don't want to end up misquoting him. But he posted something which I thought was quite a useful framework for conflict resolution, more from the standpoint of how do you manage yourself in a time of maybe if you're feeling a certain resentment towards someone. And so his post, it starts, so you have a problem with someone else. They've hurt you, misrepresented you, pushed the wrong button. What do you do when you have beef with someone else? And then he prefaces it by saying that before we go into the how, it's worth noting that there are different levels of health, different levels of health or maturity in dealing with conflict. And so he goes through the levels. He says level 1 is what he calls punishment. Punishment, and then in parentheses, in the mind. He says, this is where you replay 1,000 different ways to repay this person for the wrong that they've done, but only in your mind. Resentment and unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person will die from it. Level 2 is what he calls the pity party. In the solace of others who you know and love you, tell them about the pain that you've been caused by the other person. This is arguably better than level 1 because the grudge no longer lives only in your mind. The problem with that is that it easily descends into gossip. And he says that gossip circles are simply safe but unkind and unclosed spaces. Beware the allure of empathy without openness and perspective. Level 3, perspective partner. Here at this level, you intentionally choose a thought partner who is for you, but who doesn't flatter you. They will offer you wise and unbiased perspective while being sympathetic to your pain. You are both curious about your hurt and interested to learn any lessons. Level 4, pillar of support. Now you decide to invest in feedback as opposed to gossip. The former can feel more daunting than the latter because feedback is about talking to the person, while gossip is talking about the person. It comes with risks. You realize you may need help here. So you invite a wise, mature person to facilitate or mediate the conversation. And you talked a little bit about this earlier. And then they become your pillar of support. 5th level is basically to have that direct conversation with the person. And he says at this level, you recognize the risks of having a personal chat with the person, but the value of doing this far outweighs the risks. Your courage to do the right thing, your desire to dignify the other person by returning to them outweighs your fear. You ask them for permission to chat, choose a good time. Eventually, he says that I think what I really like about this is that he says, by doing this, this has the potential to deepen your friendship or to teach you something new. And I think that's important because in order to have good conflict resolution, I think what you want to arrive at ultimately is a level of trust with the person. If you trust me, if I trust you, then we know that we have created we've created the right boundaries for us to have these discussions. And we know that even if it maybe gets a little if it does eventually get a little heated and elevated, we know that because we trust one another, that it will not put the relationship at risk. That we can have those difficult conversations knowing that this is a safe space to do that. So the trust is important. And I really like this last line. He said that conflict is simply the absence of the right conversation.
Abel, thank you for that. Those are really wise comments, and they do resonate with me. In my own life, I do that. The starting point must look within yourself. You must look within yourself. Even when I say, do you find a way to resolve a conflict between you and the other party? You must look within yourself, asking the question, is it a problem to be solved or is polarity to be managed? I can give you an example. Mandela, as opposed to Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe, when he fought and won for the independence of Rhodesia, what did he do? He looked at the problem of the whites leaving their colonial masters as a problem to be solved. What did he do? Get rid of the whites, repossess their land. They all left. That's why they changed Rhodesia into Zimbabwe today. What has happened to them? The whole economy collapsed. That is a route that he took, because he took it to say that the way to resolve this, when we get independence, we completely resolve this by getting rid of the whites. But Mandela, what did he do? Back to Abel's point. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. He had a lot of time to think. When he came out from 27 years in prison, he had a lot of time to think about the way Abel has put it there. Level 1, level 2, up to level 5. And he concluded, without me telling me, I'm quite convinced that he knew that this is not a problem to be solved. Because if the problem to be solved, he would have done exactly what Robert Mugabe would have done. He would get rid of the whites, and that would be another form of apartheid. He would introduce laws that are totally the opposite of what they did for the blacks before. He realized, no, we don't do that. So he embraced the whites. He allowed them to come in there. He found what is good. How did he celebrate? Rugby, Springbok. I mean, this was the thing that everybody, the black, detested, but he said this is a good thing. He brought that in. So all the good things he kept. And the interesting thing was, he jumped from level 1 to level 5 immediately as Abel had put it. Forgive and forget. So who did he bring? Bishop Desmond Tutu. He brought Bishop Desmond Tutu, who was spiritualist, religious man that's well respected. He then brought him, and together they came up with a movement called Forgive and Forget. This is level 5. He then said, we now say we forgive and
Desmond
forget.
Tutu was like you bringing in the cabin crew to Min Bong
Was it?
Mongta.
Exactly.
It's a lot harder to abuse
It's much harder to
archbishop.
abuse an archbishop. But he brought archbishop there. And the interesting thing was this. Considering the man was in prison, in the early episode I made reference to this. I don't mind repeating it. It's such a wonderful thing. When we went to Robben Island, and you came with me, you were young then, and your brother came, your mom came, and we went to the place where together he was there, Mandela, and the fellow prisoners. The guy who was a tourist guide, when he introduced us to that place, he said, every day for 7 years, Mandela and I and the other fellow prisoners were asked to carry this limestone from one end of the limestone and carry it to the other end. The very next day, carry the same limestone and back there. Do it for 7 years. You know what Mandela said to us in that period? When they release us, we shall forgive them. Already he said this in prison. Why? Because he had been reflecting about this. If he comes back into power when they release us, he already knew when the power is granted to him, we shall forgive them. Do that.
Back to that point on
Yeah.
know the Kissinger quote on diplomacy being the restraint of power.
Yeah.
I mean that is a huge restraint of power.
Absolutely.
But the irony is in
People
restraining
wanted
power.
revenge.
Yeah, but the irony is that in restraining his power, and not choosing revenge, but instead choosing to celebrate
Absolutely.
differences. Some people might think, well, isn't that a bit of a sign of weakness? Now you have the power, shouldn't you be wielding that power for revenge? But you see, the interesting thing is, had he had done that, I don't think that we would talk so much about him in the history books.
Absolutely. Mandela, I always return to him because he never pretended to be anything other than a normal human being. At the height of his power, at the height of his popularities, he stepped down. He conceded power. He gave up power at the height of it all. And this is a wonderful man. You think about it. Most people say power corrupts. At the height of his power, he said, it's time for me to let go. Let others come in and do it. My boss once said, Idris, the graveyard is full of indispensable people who think that when they're alive, when they're dead, the whole world will collapse. When they're dead and buried, the world go on really well without them. And Mandela understood that there's a time and season for everybody, and there's a time and season for leadership as well. Different types of leaders come in and run an organization and a company. So he understood precisely the time. So I really look, if you ask me today, other than Jesus Christ, the one person I put on the pedestal in leadership is Mandela, hands down.
Yeah, and even for Christians, I often personally think that the error of many Christian leaders as well is our approach to thinking that because what I believe is right, therefore what you believe is wrong on all planes.
Right.
Rather than trying to find what the middle ground is. And I really like this, something that Nicky Gumbel said. And he once said that Christians don't hold a monopoly to the truth.
Yeah.
There is truth to be found in other sources,
Yeah.
in other religions. There's even truth to be found in atheist voices and thought as well. If you listen well enough,
You will find
some slither of
Yeah.
truth in there.
Absolutely,
and the
you're
key
right.
is how can we, create an environment, whether it's at home or whether it's in our teams, to be able to see those truths a little clearly. And I believe that if we're able to do that, we would have a much easier time, whether it's solving problems or managing those polarities, to give us a bit more endurance to do that. Because ultimately, it's about the endurance to play the game.
I just look at the Quran. In the Quran, 13 verse 11, we said very clear, indeed Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is inside themselves. That's the truth. Absolutely right. It's very clear you have to change inside you.
Yeah. And actually, sometimes in choosing to, seek out truths from other voices and other sources, rather than it being something that might deviate you from your own convictions for your own truths, actually, sometimes you might find that by just that example that you shared earlier, by listening to things like that, that can actually further strengthen your own convictions.
Absolutely.
So I always feel like we should not be so insecure sometimes about our faith.
Our faith.
You know? And it's for that reason that I had this personal, a bit of a tension because we bought Ayla a book recently. And this book, because it looks so inviting, but then when I actually read it, I realized, actually it's a book on, it's actually a book on evolution. But it's in a kid's format. It's called The Book of Life.
The Book of Life.
But it's essentially teaching them about
evolution.
evolution. And I had a moment of thinking, oh, wow, should I really be reading this? And it's a favorite book right now. Should I really be reading this book to her? But then I just figured, you know what? I'm just going to keep doing it. I think what's important is that because I realized just basic human psychology, if she grows up and her memory of me was, my dad always told me not to read up about evolution, then she would probably want to do that. Because you often want to do the very thing that you're told not to do. But so I said, actually, you know what? Rather than telling her we're not going to read this book anymore, I'm going to continue to, and I read it to her almost every night.
It's fine.
But what's important is that you at least create a larger environment where the truth that you believe in is evident.
It's larger than that other.
Correct, and not just evident in talking about it through a book, but just evident in the way that you live.
Absolutely.
And if I'm convinced that the way that we live our day-to-day lives is reflective of Christian values, then I have no problem in allowing my daughter to read a book every night about evolution. So I think in the same way, this applies to so many things. Like we should not be so insecure. A lot of resentment and tensions stem from insecurity about our own core beliefs. And when that security in our beliefs is rocked, that is often when we begin to escalate and to begin to have a more maybe antagonistic approach, or use more antagonistic language to the other person who seems to be attacking our values. But then when we feel completely secure in what we believe in, then again, we'll be more willing to make certain concessions because we know that, by finding a middle ground in this area, that is not me deviating from my core belief, but this is me thinking, well, as part of my core belief, perhaps managing this conflict is in line with the core belief. And so maybe I will give this person that point in the interest of maintaining unity and peace to achieve our true north.
Wonderful.
We talked, a large part of this, as we mentioned earlier, is endurance. So we're going to end today's episode, but I think it'll be a good placeholder, a little earmark for us to maybe talk about endurance. How do we endure? Because as we said earlier, leadership, including managing conflict, which is a huge part of leadership, it has a cost. So how do we ensure that we are able to do it for the long run, to endure the cost of dropping the ego, to endure whatever else that we have to endure, to do that over a long period of time? So next week, we'll talk a little bit more about endurance. But that ends episode 20 for this week's episode of The Game of Impossible. Once again, thank you so much for listening and for watching as well on YouTube. We just want to encourage you, if you have not subscribed yet, please do subscribe to our channel, to our Spotify as well. It really helps us as we continue to see how we can level up this podcast. Right now, it's still very much a two-man show. We do this conversation. I do all of the editing and the social media. But of course, we do want to be able to grow this so that we'll eventually be able to bring in guests as well, and just to create a better experience for you, our viewers and listeners as well. So please do subscribe and please engage with us as well. Let us know your thoughts too. If you have ideas for maybe things that you'd like us to talk about, please leave them in the comments. As you see, we do listen to those, and sometimes they do form the basis for our conversations. So big thank you to all of you for listening, and we'll see you next week.